as usual.
Burning. Yeah, I think it's Friday.
Thank you.
Don't you?
Oh, wow.
So let's pick up where we left off. You know, we said that as blood moves from the arterioles into the capillaries and then into the veins, that there's a progressive decrease in pressure. That blood moves from point A to point B from an area of high pressure into an area of low pressure. So that by the time the blood reaches the capillaries, let's say of the feet, you might have a mean pressure of 20 or 30 millimeters mercury, as opposed to 100 in the aorta. Well, that pressure that's present within the capillaries is necessary to propel the blood all the way back up against gravity to the heart. Okay? And sometimes that pressure in and of itself isn't enough. So with respect to the venous system, there are several adaptations that assist with venous return that help the blood overcome gravity and return to the heart. One of these assist mechanisms we talked about was venous valves. Now, if you look at the deep veins of the lower extremities, most of these deep veins are sandwiched between large muscle groups. So if this is the calf, for instance, you'll have some anterior muscles, you'll have some posterior muscles, and then sandwiched between the two groups of muscles with blue. Blue is always the color of systemic veins. So sandwiched between, you'll have veins that are returning blood up toward the heart. We said that these veins are going to have unidirectional valves like this that assure that blood flows in one direction and doesn't leak backwards. Well, when you contract these muscles that surround the deep veins, contraction of the muscles compresses the veins, forcing blood to move. And because of the presence of these valves, the blood can only move in one direction. That's toward the heart. So we refer to this as the muscular pump. It keeps blood moving in one direction, back toward the heart. Okay? If we don't activate the muscular pump, blood within a venous system tends to be stagnant. That's not a good thing. Because venous stasis can lead to what? If blood doesn't move. Well, not an embolism, but it can, but a clot formation. What do we call a clot? A thrombus. So if you have a clot that forms in a deep vein, you would call it a DVT, a deep venous thrombosis. And yes, if you form a clot within a deep venous system and a piece breaks loose, we call that an embolus. In this case, it would be called a thromboembolus because it's derived from a thrombus. Where would that thromboembolus travel up to with circulation?
Pulmonary.
Yeah, pulmonary circulation. It would travel back up to the right atrium. From the right atrium, it would pass through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it would be ejected into the main pulmonary trunk, and then would be filtered out within one of the pulmonary arteries. And we call that a pulmonary embolism. So the valves, as well as the muscle pump, assist with venous return. There is another pump called the respiratory pump that also assists venous return. And I'm going to kind of draw this to illustrate. If this is the chest, then this is the diaphragm here. Let's see, now let's draw the right atrium. This. Here's the inferior vena cava. Okay, so this is thoracic cavity, abdominal cavity. When you take a breath in, when you inspire, you move the diaphragms down like this. Okay? So in moving the diaphragms down, you expand the height of the thoracic cavity. And in doing so, you expand the thoracic volume. So you make the thoracic cavity larger. Now, Boyle's law of physics states that pressure and volume are indirectly proportionate. That if you increase the volume within the thoracic cavity, then intrathoracic pressure falls. Okay. So as you expand volume, that's going to lead to a drop in thoracic pressure. At the same time, by pushing down on the diaphragms, by contracting the diaphragms and having them extend down into the abdominal cavity, what happens to the abdominal cavity? Does it increase in volume or decrease?
Decrease.
So it decreases in volume, which leads to an increase in pressure. So intra-abdominal pressure increases at the same time that intrathoracic pressure decreases. Now, so we have increased pressure being exerted upon the inferior vena cava, okay? Whereas you have a drop in pressure above the diaphragm. That part of the inferior vena cava and right atrium that's in above the diaphragm. So by taking the breath in, we're creating a pressure gradient, where the pressure is higher here than it is up here. And that pressure gradient facilitates blood flow. Because remember, blood always flows from an area of higher pressure into an area of lower pressure. So we call that the respiratory pump. But again, it's an assist mechanism. All right. Now, you should already know that blood pressure varies with cardiac output, systemic vascular resistance, and intravascular volume. We talked about that. And those are the three factors that influence blood pressure. Short-term blood pressure control is mediated by the autonomic nervous system and chemical controls. Long-term, by the kids. What do I mean? Well, your blood pressure is not a stable number. Last time you went to the doctor, you may have had a blood pressure of 120/70. It doesn't mean that throughout the 24-hour period your blood pressure is 120/70. It means that that day, sitting down at rest, you got a measurement of 120/70. But if you were to put a 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure cuff on you and said, okay, it's connected to a little computer chip, go ahead, whatever you do, just keep this little pump on you, and you'd feel it inflating periodically throughout the day. And the next day you'd come back and it'd disconnect it, and you'd kind of plug it into his computer and get a display, a readout of your blood pressures throughout the day. And so what you would find is that your blood pressure would go up and down, in part depending upon activity, depending upon what you ingested, if you took any drugs, if you took any, what kind of food you ate. If you had a lot of salt, your blood pressure may go up a little bit higher. If you were sleeping, it may come down. But it's going to vary throughout the day. It's not going to remain static. It's going to kind of do this thing. And so blood pressure can vary from minute to minute. Okay? And what we're saying here is that minute-to-minute control, that short-term regulation of blood pressure, is a function of the autonomic nervous system and chemical control mechanisms. Over the longer term, the kidneys play a major influence in your general range of blood pressure. So we're going to talk about both of these control mechanisms, the short-term and the long-term control mechanisms today. Okay? It turns out that the brainstem plays a large role in control of blood pressure, specifically the medulla oblongata. Okay? In fact, it's in the medulla oblongata where you find cardiac centers and a vasomotor center that influence blood pressure. The cardiac centers are going to influence heart rate and contractility of the heart. And of course, if you increase contractility, that increases cardiac output. So these are two factors that influence blood pressure. The vasomotor center is going to influence the degree of vasoconstriction versus vasodilation of blood vessels. In other words, it's going to influence systemic vascular resistance. Okay? Now, the way in which these control centers, the cardiac and vasomotor centers, are regulated is via baroreceptors. These are stretch receptors that are located within the carotid sinus and the aortic arch. Okay. So these little red dots represent baroreceptors here within the carotid sinuses. These are located within the aortic arch. So we call these carotid baroreceptors, aortic baroreceptors. And they're going to sense when the walls of either the sinus or the arch stretch. What would bring about an increase in stretch within those walls? An increase in blood pressure. So as blood pressure increases, these baroreceptors sense that increase in stretch. As blood pressure falls, these baroreceptors sense that decrease in stretch. Now, when we talked about the nervous system in AP1, I didn't talk too much about this role of these cranial nerves, but the glossopharyngeal nerves carry afferent fibers from the carotid baroreceptors toward the cardiac control centers in the brain. Whereas the vagus is a cranial nerve that carries afferent fibers from the aortic baroreceptors to the brainstem. So, in a sense, these receptors send information up to the medulla, letting the medulla just know what's going on with pressure indirectly through stretch. So again, for the carotid sinuses, it's the glossopharyngeal nerve. For the aortic baroreceptors, it's going to be the vagus, the wanderer. Okay. So these receptors, okay, these afferent nerve fibers from the receptors are going to travel up to the medulla and interact with the nucleus. Okay. Remember, a nucleus is a cluster of nerve cell bodies. This nucleus is called the nucleus tractus solidarius. Okay? And it's going to influence both the parasympathetic nervous system, whose fibers are carried by the vagus, and it's going to influence the sympathetic nervous system. Okay? For example, if blood pressure is high, okay, then the nucleus tractus solidarius sends excitatory impulses to the vagus to increase parasympathetic input to the heart. So in the face of high blood pressure, the vagus is sending down impulses that are going to do what to heart rate? And the negative effect. It's going to slow down the heart. And it's going to slow down conduction through the AV node. We'll talk about that in more detail. When it excites the parasympathetics at the same time, it's going to inhibit the sympathetic activity. Okay? So that you're inhibiting sympathetic activity that would otherwise increase heart rate, increase contractility, and conduction velocity. Remember this, that's this balance we talk about between sympathetics and parasympathetics. If you excite the parasympathetic nervous system, then the sympathetic stands down. Okay? The sympathetic nervous system is also involved in vasoconstriction of arteries and veins. If you inhibit sympathetic activity, then these arteries and veins vasodilate. So you get the idea that if blood pressure is high, we're slowing down the heart and we're bringing about vasodilation. We decrease in heart rate, therefore we decrease in cardiac output, because cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. And we're vasodilating, which lowers systemic vascular resistance. Those activities will serve to bring down the blood pressure because it was high. Does that make sense to everyone? There's a lot going on there. Yeah, I'll break it down a little bit more. Now, what happens if blood pressure is low? Do you think that we stimulate the vagal parasympathetic? No. Then if blood pressure is low, we inhibit activation of the vagus, its parasympathetics, and instead we stimulate sympathetic activity. And so if we stimulate sympathetic activity, we're going to increase heart rate, contractility, conduction velocity. We're going to bring about vasoconstriction in arteries and veins. And all of those activities are going to serve to raise blood pressure. At the same time, parasympathetics are going to stand down. One second.
Oh, shit. It's a lot more than I thought it was gonna be. What does the TS stand for?
He said, I don't know, it's a weird word. Hold on. I searched all of this word.
Yeah. I can't find it.
Catherine, you know how I got those words wrong with my phone test? I finally learned looking at it yesterday.
NTS.
It's that. What is the end to start? Because they keep
Dr. Pinner.
Yeah, let me give you a little visual.
Dr. Pinner, what did you say NTS stands for?
NTS,
Yeah.
nucleus tractus solidarius. I'm not going to ask you that.
Oh, okay.
But it's just kind of the control center within the medulla that then either activates sympathetics or parasympathetics.
Gotcha.
All right, so let's see if we do this.